Nobody thinks that there were only two resurrection appearances, one to Peter and one to Paul. Nobody thinks that.
I do. Welcome to Paulogia.
Paulogia. I never know how to pronounce his name.
Where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians.
You've actually interacted with his work on your podcast. You've interacted with one of his videos. He's an atheist YouTuber.
It's nice that I left such an indelible impression on Dr. Craig. Last month I issued a what-if challenge to Christians. It was a thought experiment designed to test a particular component of the Jesus resurrection story. And more specifically, the scenario that I hypothesize is the most probable explanation. Sadly, no Christians took me up on the challenge. Perhaps it was confusing. Perhaps it was boring. Or perhaps there simply is no answer to be had. Now, April was Easter month, so there were a lot of resurrection-affirming scholars doing live streams and taking questions from the audience. This was my chance to put the challenge forward to the biggest names in resurrection apologetics. Dr. Gary Habermas, Dr. Mike Licona, Dr. William Lane Craig, Dr. Sean McDowell, and best-selling author Lee Strobel. Unfortunately, the character constraints of a chat box didn't allow me to fully put forth the nuance of a several-minute video. But I think I got the gist across.
Here's a question that comes from Paulogia, I believe is a skeptic.
Consider a notion that Peter and Paul were the only actual eyewitnesses to the really risen Jesus. Our Gospels and creeds would then be legendary stories. Do other lines of evidence exist that contradict such a scenario?
So I think he's saying, imagine it's just Peter and Paul were the only eyewitnesses, and then that would mean that the Gospels themselves are legendary. Are there other lines of evidence that would contradict such a notion?
Thanks, Dr. McDowell. Yes, that's the question in a nutshell.
Well, I'm not sure I grasp the whole question, but...
Any help, Dr. Craig?
I thought he meant that there were only originally two resurrection appearances claimed, one to Peter and one to Paul.
Correct. And what evidence would we have to contradict that?
Well, yes, all the evidence contradicts that. I'm surprised he would ask.
I realize that I'm a constant source of disappointment to you, Dr. Craig, but maybe humor me? If all of the evidence contradicts it, then maybe we can go through that together?
Yeah. The reports that we have in the Gospels and in Paul's letters,
Yeah, but other than that, though.
First, the inference is mistaken. Suppose that Jesus only appeared to Peter and to Paul. How would that show that the gospel accounts are legendary fictions? It wouldn't show that at all.
Yes, it's pedantically true for one who wants to miss the point. In my hypothetical, everything in the Gospels other than the resurrection accounts could be entirely accurate. Jesus may well have walked on water, for example. If not for the character limits placed on my question, I'd likely have specified that within the hypothetical construct, it's the resurrection appearances, in particular, in the Gospels and creeds, that couldn't be accurate as they include witnesses other than Peter and Paul. All the other scholars understood that we're talking about resurrection appearances here, but that insight didn't stop them from providing Gospels and creeds as examples of things that aren't Gospels and creeds.
We have, for instance, the creed.
In 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5.
You've got the appearance to Peter.
He also appeared to the 12.
Then to more than 500 at one time. Then to
James, the half-brother of Jesus.
Then to all the apostles, and then to Paul.
Yeah, this is the creed. The specific creed that made me say, other than Gospels and creeds, what do we have? So, other than this, which reflects merely what early Christians believed, but would have to be mistaken about under my hypothesis.
Number 4, 5, 6, and 7 are the Gospels.
What part of other than the Gospels says, hey, let's list all the Gospels?
In Mark knows that he's going to appear to them in Galilee as a group.
That took some very precise wording. The author of Mark has a character promising that Jesus would later appear to the disciples, but does not include those appearances to pay off the foreshadowing.
Peter was an eyewitness, and the traditional view is that his witness stands behind the Gospel of Mark.
Well, I don't think there's sufficient evidence to accept the tradition that the author of Mark based his narration on the witness of Peter. Dr. Craig makes an interesting point. If Mark had described an appearance to Peter, it would in no way contradict my hypothetical. It would match entirely. But since Mark doesn't actually contain any appearances, let's move on.
You've got in Matthew, Jesus appears to the women folk on the way back from the tomb. He appears to all the male disciples out in Galilee.
Another gospel. But let's make note of the stories.
In Luke, you've got appearances to the 11, and then you have to Peter, to the Emmaus disciples.
Another gospel. More stories. Different ones.
In John, you've got the appearance to Mary Magdalene, probably the rest of the women involved. We could discuss that if you want. Then you've got the appearance to all but Judas, and then you've got the appearance to all, including Judas. Then you've got the appearance to 7 disciples on the Sea of Galilee. So
more stories. Last gospel. Whew, got through it.
And the appearance to the 12 is independently attested in John and Luke.
Multiply attested in John and Luke? None of these individual resurrection stories are repeated in any second source.
You've got multiple independent accounts, at least from Matthew, Luke, and John, because you've got a recurrent attestation, and then Paul.
This is the equivalent of having a suspect tell police that he spent the day with friends. They check with friend number 1, who reports the group were all together on a road trip to Vegas. Friend number 2 reports that the group hung out indoors playing video games. Now, do the friends independently attest to the suspect's alibi? Should we be concerned about the differences? Should we harmonize them? Maybe they did both? I mean, this couldn't be further from the point of the challenge itself. But to pretend that non-overlapping stories attest to each other is stretching credulity beyond what is reasonable.
As I said before, these multiple independent traditions behind the gospel stories that also show that this isn't correct.
Dr. Craig, none of these accounts overlap in the first place. To appeal to some kind of independent traditions behind them as additional attestation is to admit both that there are degrees of separation between the events and the writer, while simultaneously trying to sell the idea that a fourth-hand rumor is somehow more reliable than a first-hand report because there were more people involved.
You know, what more are you looking for here?
Well, that's literally my question. Is there more? I'm not commenting about the sufficiency or reliability of the Gospels and Creeds. I'm asking if there's anything more than the Gospels and Creeds.
We have Peter in Acts.
Yep, my question had Peter already.
And he gets up right there in Jerusalem a few weeks after the resurrection and says that God raised this Jesus, to which we're all eyewitnesses.
Yep, the Peter of my hypothetical would certainly explain that.
You have Paul, who himself was an eyewitness.
You do, almost as if the hypothetical already said that Paul was an eyewitness.
He may well have known about the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearance of Jesus even before his conversion on the road to Damascus. So,
not to nitpick, but he may well have known is not technically evidence, more of a hypothetical, kind of like my hypothetical.
I would say even if it was just Peter and Paul, I think we have reason to trust Paul's testimony.
Yes, if we posit that Paul was an actual eyewitness, then we could have reason to believe he was a witness. Anything new?
And then we have, at a minimum, Polycarp and Clement from sources outside the Bible confirming and corroborating what the disciples tell them.
Okay, finally something new on the board. Polycarp and Clement. Let's hear more about them.
Clement, who was ordained by Peter himself.
That sounds promising. Sadly, we have no record from Clement himself that indicates that he knew Peter at all. This ordination idea is from a 9th century list of popes. But we can grant this tradition for the sake of this discussion. It would then mean that Clement knew one of the true eyewitnesses.
Right in the 1st century, he wrote a letter to the Corinthian church talking about the confidence the disciples had because of the resurrection.
Okay. So Mr. Strobel is talking about chapter 42 of Clement's letter to the Corinthians. Sadly, this passage doesn't specify which apostles were preaching the Gospels, so any guess about which would really just be a guess. It says these men were fully assured by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, which again is somewhat ambiguous. Were they eyewitnesses, or were they just super convinced by the resurrection? In the very same sentence, these men also had full assurance by the Holy Ghost, which doesn't imply physically witnessing the Holy Ghost, just having that internal feeling of confidence. No, this vague allusion doesn't do anything to push against my scenario. How about Polycarp?
And then Polycarp, who was appointed Bishop of Smyrna by John, he sat under the teachings of he certainly knew John.
Yeah, he did.
Did he though? Polycarp himself claims no such thing. That's just a later tradition.
He wrote a letter to the Philippians in which he mentions the resurrection no fewer than 5 times. And he says they had confidence because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
It's a pretty short letter, so I read it over in a few different translations just to be sure. While he talked about Jesus being raised, at no point in the letter does Polycarp make reference to anyone at all being an eyewitness of the resurrected Jesus. He does say that if anyone denies the resurrection, that they are the firstborn of Satan, but that doesn't contradict my hypothetical. It's entirely consistent with it. Sorry, Mr. Strobel.
Plus Paul's own firsthand experience with the 12 when he visited Jerusalem in AD 36.
He interviews Peter and James. And then before the book of 1 Thessalonians is written, so still pre-canonical, he goes to Jerusalem again, and this time Peter, James, and John are there. Then you got Paul, of course, he's there.
Well, now maybe we're getting somewhere. Evidence in Galatians, one of the uncontested letters of Paul, called this because there's no serious debate against it being a genuine letter from the Apostle Paul. Since I too am convinced that it was written by Paul, and Paul is one of the men in the hypothetical who actually saw Jesus, I should be taking this seriously. If we accept Dr. Craig's dates, Jesus was killed around 30 AD. Paul's first visit to Jerusalem was around 36 AD, meeting Peter and James. The text itself specifies that the second visit was 14 years later to meet Peter, James, and John. Then, somewhere around 52 AD, Paul is writing 1 Corinthians, where he includes a creed that mentions Peter, James, and John.
That's the 4 biggest, most influential names in the early church, and 2 of the names are not on the list here. It says, what about Peter and Paul? Okay, what about James and John?
How could I put forth a hypothetical that would place Paul in the position of coming to believe that James and John saw resurrected Jesus, when really they didn't, even after he had a chance to talk to them about it face to face? Is my idea dead in the water?
It specifies that Paul went to talk about the gospel.
Well, hold on now. That's the second visit. For the first visit, Paul says he went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Peter. Get acquainted sounds pretty casual, right? They hung out for 15 days, getting to know each other. Keep in mind that in my hypothetical, both Peter and Paul actually saw the really real risen Jesus, so they would have had a lot to talk about with each other. But what of James, the other pillar Dr. Habermas fears I'm ignoring? Paul's first visit description continues. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother, which he follows up with, I assure you before God that what I am writing you is no lie. Paul really wants everyone to be super clear that he didn't see anyone other than James. Did Paul have a chance to talk to James, or just set eyes on him across the courtyard with a gentle nod? We can make guesses, but that's just adding speculation to the text. What we know is that at some point, Paul laid eyes on James, the brother of Jesus. The other thing we can know is that the reason Paul includes this story at all is to emphasize a point. The gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Sure, Paul may have palled around with Peter and gave James a fist bump, but Paul promises that those men taught him nothing about the gospel.
Paul defines the gospel several times. It always involves the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus.
Right. So Paul received no information about the resurrection of Jesus from any man, including Peter or James, on this first visit. On the second visit, Paul does seem to want to do some fact-checking. But now we're talking at least 17 years after the death of Jesus. 17 years of James and John listening to the genuine eyewitness Peter tell the story over and over. Maybe even some small details changing here and there in the narration. Repeated exposure to an idea. dramatically increases the formation of false memory. 17 years for James and John to be prone to suggestion and post-event contamination of the kind that can lead to outright false memories. 17 years for James and John to develop implanted memories, like in this study that gently led 25% of participants to sincerely believe they were lost in the mall as a child. 17 years for James and John to misattribute Peter's memories and feelings as their own, like this study, where one group of students would propose to a Pepsi machine on a campus walk. Another group would merely watch this happen, and yet another group told to merely imagine proposing to a Pepsi machine. In a matter of weeks, members of all three groups would come to insist that they personally were in the group that had actually proposed to the Pepsi machine. 17 years for James and John to be repeatedly recalling their time with Jesus, incorporating distorted details alongside genuine ones, as we know humans rewrite and reshape our memories each time we access them.
I see him over there in the midst. There he is. And John, yeah, I think I see. Could that happen? That's a known psychological phenomenon.
We could go on and on about the unreliability of memory, particularly in the kind of closed ranks community that early Christianity seems to have been, over a long period of time. And even if we concede a shorter period of time, like the mere few years Habermas often insists on without support, these memory effects don't necessarily take long. Studies like the Pepsi machine proposal deal in weeks, not years. By the time Paul visited Jerusalem the second time, 17 years later, James and John may well have been entirely on board with resurrection appearances, at very least sincerely believing that Peter had one, if not themselves.
I can't even imagine a meeting where Paul didn't say something like, hey, I'll tell you guys what Jesus looked like to me on the road to Damascus if you tell me what Jesus looked like to you on Sunday evening.
In at least 3 of the resurrection appearances, those described in John 20, Luke 24, and John 21, the people didn't recognize Jesus. He had to otherwise convince them who he was. Attribute this phenomenon or motif as you will, it seems that the appearance of resurrected Jesus in these accounts didn't have to match how he looked on a pre-crucifixion Sunday evening.
And Bart Ehrman says, a remarkable sentence, where do we get closer to eyewitness testimony than Paul's recounting what he got for James and Peter?
Well, this quote from Bart Ehrman is from his book, Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth, and is in the context of affirming that Jesus was a real person who lived. Dr. Ehrman does not suggest that this passage is useful for affirming resurrection appearances. Context is important, Dr. Habermas. I'm sure you agree.
To me, the biggest thing Paul brings to the table is not even his appearance. The biggest thing Paul did was interview the other disciples.
Yet, sadly, Paul doesn't tell us what happened in this interview. Dr. Habermas wants us to imagine what happened, but that's inference and conjecture, no less than the hypothetical I put forward. If we let Paul describe the meeting for himself, as for those who are held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism. They added nothing to my message. Some Christians interpret they added nothing to my message to mean that Peter, James, and John must have been in agreement with Paul. But in my opinion, these first 2 chapters of Galatians are much more clearly read with a contempt between Peter and Paul, and I'm not alone in this interpretation. Just a few verses down, Paul says of Peter, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned.
To me, that's a knockout.
To me, this is, at best, an ambiguous mess, where Paul seems to be at odds with men for whom history has left us none of their own words about what they believed or what they saw. Dr. Craig and Dr. Habermas want to imagine affirmation and harmony, but discord, false memories, and pressure to conform make my hypothetical, or virtually any scenario, just as likely given the few words we have.
This data it's fantastic.
I think that is a pretty good...
There's really good evidence.
I agree.
I think we have very good evidence that the appearances were not initially confined to just 2 people, Peter and Paul.
As a group, you listed the Gospels and a creed, none of which corroborate each other on these appearances, and put forth an interpretation of a meeting 17 years after the event, hypothesizing details not supported by the text that are no more plausible than my hypothesis. In fact, far less plausible if you're in any way skeptical about the supernatural. But why do I even put forth this hypothetical? It seems only Dr. McDowell had the instinct to know where I'm going with this.
So for me, I don't find any compelling reason to think that this story is legendary. But let me ask you this one. We have a few minutes left.
Yeah.
Perhaps the most common objection to the resurrection is that the apostles had hallucinations.
Yeah.
And I know you deal with that in your book, but in academic circles, not necessarily popular circles, that's probably the most common explanation to discount it. What would be your response to the idea they had hallucinations and didn't actually see Jesus?
Exactly. If all the evidence of resurrection appearances is consistent with and can be fully explained with just Peter and Paul as the only actual eyewitnesses to resurrected Jesus, then it is automatically true that all the evidence can be fully explained with Peter and Paul being sincerely mistaken about what they saw. Even to the person themselves, sincerely mistaken is indistinguishable from sincerely correct.
Hallucinations are like dreams. They happen in individual minds.
So
you can't wake your spouse up in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a great dream about a vacation in Hawaii.
So go back
Let's
to sleep.
both go back
Join
to
me in
sleep.
my
We'll have the
dream.
same dream. We'll save all the airfare. We'll save all the hotel.
We can't do that.
500 people having the same hallucination at the same time will be a bigger miracle than the resurrection itself.
But Dr. Lycona and Mr. Strobel, we don't have 500. We have a story that there were 500. No evidence has been given for an actual witness other than Peter and Paul. This is the point. We don't need to explain 500. We don't need to explain 12. We need to explain two. Two people who had entirely different experiences years apart. Perhaps one with the common phenomenon of post-bereavement hallucination experiences, and one with common post-traumatic guilt symptoms. And we're done. This non sequitur about group hallucinations is entirely a non sequitur until such time as you actually have evidence for a group of people experiencing something, which you don't.
This is a hypothesis that has virtually nothing to commend it.
That's your opinion, Dr. Craig, but perhaps I've given my viewers something to think about. I laid out my full how Christianity probably began, no resurrection required scenario in this short video. And let me know in the comments if you agree or where I've gone wrong. See you there.